Hello and welcome back to CSS3 Animations. In all of our prior videos, we've been talking about using the transition property to create CSS3 animations. Well, in this video, we're going to talk about creating an animation that runs by default. In other words, we don't want to wait till we hover over a button to cause an animation to happen. We want this animation to be running and looping over and over again, no matter what the user is doing. And we can do that using a few animation properties. So we're going to be using animation properties instead of transition properties. And with animation properties, CSS allows us to create keyframes for our animations. And in this video, we're going to talk about how to do that. So we're going to take this in two steps. We're going to create an animation of an airplane flying across the sky, dragging a banner behind it. So this would be a banner for a 20% off of everything sale. So we have two different images we're going to work with. We have the image that we see here, which is a PNG image of a plane pulling a banner. And the image is exactly 960 pixels wide, which is what the width of our banner is going to be. And you'll notice that we have extra transparent pixels on top and bottom, left and right, and that's okay. I just included it to be the exact same size as the banner, just so that it would be a little bit easier to position the element. So in addition to this element, we have another image, which is just a JPEG image of the sky. And this image, we have to zoom out to see it all, is exactly twice as wide as the image of the airplane. So instead of 960 pixels wide, this one is 1920 pixels wide. And in our animation, I want this image to constantly be moving and looping over and over again. Well, in order to make this loop seamless, what I did was I created an image that's exactly twice as wide as the banner itself, and then I made the left side of the image exactly the same as the right half of the image. So if we were to take this layer here, and you don't have to know Photoshop to follow along with this series because you don't actually have to go into Photoshop to do anything, but I'm going to grab this layer and drag it into our other file here. I'm going to drag it all the way over here to the left, and then I need to put it behind the plane layer so we can see it. And remember, it's exactly twice as wide as our viewable area here. So think of this viewable area as the actual banner itself. Well, this image of the sky in the background is going to be constantly moving to the left. And then when it gets exactly halfway across, or basically when the right edge of this image lines up with the right edge of the banner, once it's moved all the way across, we're actually in the exact same position, or we have the exact same look to our banner as we did at the very beginning, because again, the right half of this banner looks exactly the same as the left half of this banner. If I were to hit Control Z to undo that move, I've already moved this all the way across the stage so that it's now right aligned with the stage instead of left aligned. If I hit Control Z to undo it, take a close look at the clouds and you'll notice that they don't change at all because the clouds look exactly the same. So we can create a looping animation here by causing this layer to move halfway across and then just loop back to the beginning, because when it loops back to the beginning, that first frame will look exactly like this last frame and it will create a seamless transition there. And if you don't understand anything I just said, don't worry about it. The point is, the way that this background image, the way that these clouds are set up, it's going to loop seamlessly. So first, let's go into our files and set this up properly. Let's go into our files, and I've got lesson 11 open here. Oops, let's try that again. Let's go to TextMate here, and I've got the files again for lesson 11 open. But what you're seeing right now is basically what we ended up with at the end of lesson 10. So if you want to follow along here, take all of the lesson 10 files and start from there. And I'm going to save all of the changes into the lesson 11 folder. So in our lesson 11 folder, well, first let's go to Chrome just to see where we're going to put this. So we have our current design here. And what I want to do is I want to put a banner up at the top announcing a 20% off sale. So I'm going to put it above the main content here, but below this top nav. So let's jump back into our HTML, and just below this top nav here, after this line break tag, we'll go to the next line here, and I'm going to create another div, this time with a class of banner. And inside that banner, I'm going to put two images, the plane and the clouds behind it. So we'll have an image, and I'm going to give this image a class of under. This will be the image of the sky itself, and we'll give it a source of, and in your lesson 11 folder, I've added a couple of image files into the image folder, one called sky and one called airplane. So you're not going to find those two files inside the lesson 10 folder. Those will be in your lesson 11 folder. But we're going to point to these two files here. So for our first file here, we're going to point our source to the images folder, which is img / and then the under image, the image that's behind the other one, is the sky image. So sky.jpg. There we go. So we're going to create another image now right after that with a class of over, and the image we're looking for there is called airplane.png. Okay, so we'll end that image tag and then close that div. And so this entire banner is contained with this code right here, just one simple line of code. So let's save our index file, jump into Chrome, and I'm going to navigate to lesson 11, and I'm going to take off this #item3 there so that we're just looking at index.html, and now we have our banner. Obviously, this isn't what we want it to look like in the end, but we have our beginnings anyway. So let's jump into our CSS and actually make this function. So we're going to do something similar to what we've done before. Remember, when we had our icons down here for these 4 buttons, we have 2 images stacked on top of each other, one that's semi-transparent and one that's a solid color. And we gave them both the exact same top and left locations or coordinates. And we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to create some CSS for this banner div. We're going to make it 960 pixels wide by 200 pixels tall. And we're going to place both of these images right on top of each other. So let's go back to our code, jump over to our CSS file. I'm going to go down to the very bottom here, skip a couple lines, and we're going to create some code for our banner. So we've created this comment line here, and now we'll go to the next line and create our rules. So we're looking for a div with the class of banner, so we'll type dot banner. I'm going to give it a width of 960 pixels, a height of 200 pixels, and I want to center it on the stage. I don't want it to be aligned to the left. I want it to be centered with all the rest of our content. So I'm going to set our margin, if we can spell that right, to 0 space auto. And then I also want to put a little bit of a bottom margin on it. So we'll say margin hyphen bottom, and we'll set that to 20 pixels. And also I want to set the overflow to hidden, because remember that sky background is a lot larger than the banner itself, and we want anything that's outside of the banner boundaries to be invisible. So we're going to set overflow to hidden. So now if we save that and refresh our page, everything is cropped off. The airplane is still there, but it's now outside the boundaries of our banner, so it's hidden. We can't see that airplane. So now we need to absolutely position the sky and the airplane on top of each other. So let's go back to our code and let's do that. So we basically have 2 images inside our banner. So the first thing I'm going to do is to create a rule for what these images have in common. So we'll say banner space image. So any images inside that div with the class of banner is going to have these rules. First of all, they're going to be absolutely positioned. So we need to set position to absolute, and they're both going to have a top value of 0. Now the left value is going to be a little bit different at the start, but we'll get to that in just a second. So by setting both of the top values to 0, we can make that work. However, remember, if you have an item with a position of absolute, you need to make the parent item's position equal to relative. Otherwise, the position you type in here will be the top left corner of the browser, not the top left corner of the containing element. So for the containing element, which is this banner rule here, we're going to set the position of it to relative, so that this absolute position down here will work appropriately. So let's save that and refresh our page, and now we can see our airplane over the clouds. So that's a good start. So for the rest of this video, I want to get the clouds working, and then in the next video, we'll actually create an animation with the plane itself. So with the clouds, we're going to go back into our file, and we're going to create a new rule. We'll We'll skip a couple lines. For the banner div, again, with an image class of under. Remember, the sky image is the one that has a class of under applied to it, and we want to animate this under image. And we're going to animate the left property of it. Right now, by default, I'm going to set the left property to 0, and it's already set to 0 by default, but I just want to put it there just to make sure that it's in the right place. And then we're going to animate the left position of this image to -960. Now remember, this image is actually 1920 pixels wide. And when we move it over 960 pixels, then that will put it in place so that the right half of that image is now showing. And then we'll cause that animation to loop based on a few keyframes that we're going to create. So the way we do this is very similar to the way we did transitions. However, there's a little bit less browser support, so the vendor prefixes here are absolutely essential. And since I'm dealing with Chrome here, I'm going to use the WebKit prefixes first, and then we'll add the other ones later. So we'll start with -WebKit and then instead of transition, we're going to say animation. Well, for animations, we're not going to set a particular property here. We're going to take care of that when we create our keyframes. Here, all we're going to create, or all we're going to specify, are going to be the duration. We're also going to give the animation a name, and then we can also assign it a timing function as well as an iteration count. So there's a few different properties we're dealing with here. Let's start with animation duration. And as this banner animates across, I want it to take about 10 seconds to cycle through the entire animation. Otherwise, the clouds might be moving too fast. So we're going to say 10s for 10 seconds. The next thing we need to do is give this animation a name so that when we create our keyframes for this animation, we have something to refer to it by. Because our keyframes don't go inside the same rule. We're going to have a separate rule for the keyframes. So we're going to give this animation a name. We'll say -WebKit -animation -name, colon space, and let's call this sky. We're going to be animating the sky here, so let's call it sky. I want this to be a smooth linear animation. I don't want any easing applied to it. Remember, easing, if we, for example, use the ease function, then our animation will slow down towards the end, and it'll also start off slow and speed up. So we don't want that change in speed. We want a constant rate of motion for these clouds going by. So we're going to set our timing function to linear. So we'll say WebKit animation timing function colon space, and we're going to set that equal to linear. And then we want this to loop over and over again, and we can cause that to happen using the iteration count property. And we get to that by typing WebKit -animation -iteration -count. So we could set this to 2 or 3 if we only wanted it to loop 2 or 3 times, but I want this to loop over and over again as long as we have the page open. So I'm going to set that iteration count to infinite. And there we go. We're actually done with this particular rule. So again, what this rule is doing is it's defining the properties of the animation itself. It's defining a name, a duration, an easing function, and an iteration count, but it's not defining what the animation actually looks like. We're going to do that using a keyframes rule. So the way this would look without vendor prefixes is we would have an @ rule called @keyframes, and then we'd hit space and then the name of the animation. And this is going to be the same name we gave to it up here, sky. Okay, so @keyframes space sky, and then we'd have our opening and closing curly brackets there. And then we would set our beginning and ending keyframes here. So the way we do that is we say from, and then inside from, we're going to set the left position to 0 pixels. And then we'll put our closing curly brackets for that from function. And then we'll skip a couple lines and type 2. And then inside the curly brackets for that, we're going to set the left property to -960 pixels. So over the course of 10 seconds, we're going to be changing the left property of our image, of the cloud's image, from 0 to negative 960 pixels. And then since we set the iteration count to infinite, it'll just loop over and over again. As soon as it reaches this negative 960 pixels, it'll jump back to 0 pixels and start the animation over again. So before we actually can test this, we need to put our vendor prefixes for this at keyframes rule. And the way we do this is a little bit different. We're going to do the vendor prefix after the at sign. So we'll say at dash WebKit dash keyframes. So let's save that, jump back into our browser and refresh the page. And there we go. We have our clouds animating across the sky. And once it gets all the way across after 10 seconds of animation, it loops back to the beginning. And because of the way this particular file is set up, the loop is seamless and it looks really good. So we could just stop here. But why not make it a little bit more exciting? Let's animate the plane as well. And as we animate the plane in the next video, we're going to talk about how we can add even more keyframes. We don't have to go from just one value to a second value. We can actually put some more values in between. And again, we'll talk about how to do that in the next video. So thank you for watching.